The year is 1624 and a small English fishing ship drops off 14 men at the northern tip of Massachusetts Bay. The site, known as Cape Ann, is rocky and harsh. Their mission is to establish a permanent fishing settlement, meant to provide for fishermen when they arrive and prepare what they catch to be sold. When the fishermen return home, those who remain at the settlement plan on trading with the Indians for items like beaver skins and cultivating food for the next season. The construction of this small fishing post would set in motion a chain of events which would lead to the creation of Massachusetts, and as a result would define the colonization and character of New England, along with America as a whole. Four years earlier, the Pilgrims established the first permanent colony in New England, opening the door for others to try and do the same. In the years following this first foothold in the region, several new settlements popped up in New England. Thomas Weston, an English businessman, attempted to settle a colony at modern-day Weymouth, but failed after the colony nearly starved and was almost eliminated after angering all of the neighboring Indian tribes, only being saved when Plymouth rescued them. The site was abandoned for a couple months before Robert Gorges, the son of the most influential member of the Council for New England, dropped off a group of men at the settlement. This time the settlement survived and was run significantly better than it had been previously. In 1623, Portsmouth and Dover were first settled, and the man who originally settled Portsmouth, David Thompson, soon moved to an island in Massachusetts Bay which today bears his name. Monhegan, originally a small fishing camp, became a center for trade with Indians. Across New England, settlements like these began springing up, and by 1625 the Pilgrims were outnumbered by the other permanent settlements, though they were still the largest. One of these English settlements was Cape Ann. It began back in England in the city of Dorchester. As far back as the 1500s, long before any permanent English settlements had been established in the American mainland, English fishing ships would make yearly trips to the shores of Newfoundland, Massachusetts Bay, and Cape Cod. These vessels would leave England in January or February and return in September or October. During these trips, they were required to bring far more men than it took to simply man the ships. They needed to bring extra men to help catch and prepare the fish they had already caught in the relatively brief season they had to work with. Seeing this inefficiency, a group of merchants in Dorchester, England came up with a workaround and devised an experimental new method. Instead of bringing over some men to do these jobs every year, they would leave some behind in America to build a self-reliant settlement. During the fishing season, they would already have infrastructure built for preparing fish and would be able to provide fishing ships with food they had grown. After the end of the season, the fishing ships returned home to sell what they had captured. Those who remained in the settlement would grow their own food and trade with the local Indians for goods like beaver pelts, which could also be sold back in Europe. The plan was sound and quickly attracted investors, raising £3,000 for the venture. The company decided they would plant their settlement at Cape Ann because the location was great for fishing. A small 50-ton fishing boat was purchased and sent to the coast of New England, where they caught a good cargo of fish. Afterwards, the ship traveled to Cape Ann and dropped off 14 men before sailing to Spain to sell what it had captured. Those left behind began construction of houses, salt works, and infrastructure for preserving fish meat. The settlement was off to a good start and began attempting to attract colonists from other areas in New England. Specifically, they attempted to recruit the men residing in Nantasket. Nantasket was a fishing post that had become a refuge for those banished from Plymouth or those who did not support the church authorities there. Among these men at Nantasket were Reverend John Lifford, John Oldham, and Roger Conant. Lifford and Oldham had been banished from Plymouth after scheming to subvert the church there. Conant appears to have left Plymouth of his own accord shortly after with his family. After hearing about these colonists at Nantasket, the company back in Dorchester, England reached out, requesting that Lifford would be the settlement's minister, that Oldham would oversee trade with the Indians, and that Conant would become the colony's governor. Oldham declined, instead deciding to continue trading by himself. Lifford and Conant accepted the invitation, and in mid-1625 they relocated to Cape Ann and took up their roles. That year, 2 fishing ships were sent out by the company but only captured a small fare of fish, an underwhelming start. Before returning home, they left 32 settlers at Cape Ann. In 1626, 3 vessels were sent by the company. This time, one of them carried cattle and food for the settlement, but the results were no better than the previous year. The time for planting was found to be the busiest part of the fishing season. Many of the men employed in planting were ill-chosen, and there was a great depreciation in the value of the vessels. Another problem was that Cape Ann was not well suited to agriculture and farming because of its poor soil and rocky landscape. The company in Dorchester became discouraged after the venture failed to generate the profits the investors were hoping for. The company sold its vessels and abandoned the enterprise, offering to transport any settlers who wished to return back to England. Governor Conant convinced some of the men to remain in America, and they took control of the company's cattle and property still at the settlement. Seeing that Cape Ann was unsuitable for permanent settlement, in the fall of 1626, Conant relocated the colony to a nearby area called Naumkeag, which was far more suitable for settling. It was here that Roger Conant, along with the settlers who had landed at Cape Ann, founded the town of Salem. Back in England, these settlers found support from John White, a Puritan clergyman in Dorchester who rallied support for this new settlement in Salem. He was able to convince many of those who had invested in the previous company, along with new wealthy businessmen, to join this new enterprise. On March 19, 1628, this new company was able to get a patent to the land stretching from 3 miles north of the Merrimack River to 3 miles south of the Charles River, and from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. The patent was approved by the king and soon after was granted. This new company purchased all of the Dorchester Company's property at Cape Ann and Salem. John Endicott was chosen to lead an expedition to Massachusetts Bay, where his job was to pave the way for future settlers. On June 20, 1628, Endicott set sail from Weymouth, England, and began his journey to Salem. He arrived in early September. In total, including Endicott and his men, between 50 and 60 people resided in Salem at this time. Endicott soon sent 7 of his men to Boston Harbor, where they began preparing the area which is now Charlestown for a colony. At first, there was tension between the old settlers at Salem under Roger Conant and the new arrivals with Endicott, since under the new company, Conant was replaced by whoever the company wished to appoint as governor, and the settlers in Salem had not been consulted. However, Conant eased the tensions and did not resist the change in government. The patent they had gotten was a step in the right direction, but it had 2 problems. First, it was only a land grant and did not give them the power to form a government for the colony. Second, as a method to hasten colonization, the Council for New England, the group they had gotten the patent from, handed out contradictory grants with overlapping lands. This means that other companies also had a right to the same lands which they were granted. In order to address these problems, the company sought a royal charter directly from the king himself. Luckily, since Salem and the rest of Massachusetts was becoming a refuge for Puritans who were being persecuted in England, a lot of powerful Puritans and their friends began supporting the company. The Earl of Warwick and the King's Secretary of State were both supporting the company. John White, the clergyman who had garnered support for the venture and played a large role in creating the company, now used his influence to advocate for a royal charter for Massachusetts. After spending much time, effort, and money, they finally received their charter from the king, forming the Massachusetts Bay Company. The royal charter confirmed the same territorial boundaries the patent had, but this document also made provisions for a government. The colony was allowed to make laws and elect leaders. The charter clearly outlined how a government would function. A general court to meet quarterly was provided for, and annually, at the Easter session, this court was to elect a governor, deputy governor, and a board of assistants, consisting of 18 members. By an important clause, 6 assistants together with the governor or his deputy constituted a quorum, and were therefore required to be present at the sittings of the court. The General Court, consisting of the members of the Massachusetts Bay Company, known as freemen, was also given the power to add to its number, and to make such necessary laws and ordinances as should not be repugnant to the laws of England. It was this charter of a proprietary company which formed the basis of the Commonwealth government of Massachusetts for over half a century. Matthew Craddock became the company's first governor according to the charter, while in Massachusetts, Endicott was still the governor locally. Later on, the company would more directly rule the colony, removing this divide of 2 different governors. While all of this legal settlement was happening in England, Endicott and his men were struggling in Massachusetts. After Endicott arrived in Salem, the company continued sending ships filled with settlers to the colony. 400 colonists were sent via a half-dozen different ships, and the land they arrived in was one troubled with disease, starvation, and harsh winter. In a year, 80 colonists would succumb to the horrid conditions. Luckily for them, the company had no intentions of giving up on the settlement and planned on sending nearly 1,000 more colonists before the end of 1630. Before this could happen, the company had a vital decision to make. At one of the meetings of the General Court in England, the company's governor, Matthew Craddock, put forward a proposition. In a likely intentional choice of words, the company's charter did not state where the General Court meetings needed to be held, unlike charters for other companies like Virginia, which required their government to remain in England. Craddock proposed that the government of the colony, along with the charter itself, be transferred to America and rest with the settlers instead of in England. This idea, while it may seem simple in hindsight, was revolutionary at the time and led to Massachusetts having more independence than other English colonies. Soon after, a group of men, including John Winthrop and Thomas Dudley, two future governors, and one future deputy governor, along with a slew of future leaders and assistants, signed an agreement stating that they and their families would move to America if the colony's government relocated there. After much deliberation in the General Court, they agreed to transfer the charter and the government which it provided for to America. With the transfer of the government, Massachusetts ceased to be a mere trade company, as had originally been intended. Instead, it evolved into what amounted to an independent Puritan state, where the dissident religious group could escape persecution in England and have a chance to run a state as they intended. Due to this choice, the Puritan-run colony in Massachusetts faced little interference from authorities in England for decades, and began a system of self-government which appears to have taken influence from the Pilgrims in Plymouth. Not all of the investors wished to relocate to New England, and so an agreement was made that those who stuck with the venture would buy out those who remained in England. Among those who chose not to relocate to America was Governor Craddock, leaving his position vacant. After an election in the General Court, he was replaced by John Winthrop, who would lead a fleet of 11 ships and 1,000 settlers to Massachusetts and truly begin the Massachusetts Bay Colony. From the humble fishing post at Cape Ann had emerged a behemoth that would dominate New England and its development and help define America's identity as a nation.